Harper speaking. Federal agents descended upon this tranquil Beverly Hills neighborhood early this morning, transforming a peaceful residential block into a scene of intensive law enforcement activity.
FBI conducts operation at talent agent's Beverly Hills residence. 28 missing models recovered. At precisely 4:23 a.m. on a March Thursday, the imposing gates of Vincent Castellano's property swung inward. Instead of the typical procession of expensive automobiles delivering entertainment industry elites and influential figures, a convoy of dark SUVs and reinforced tactical vehicles entered, transporting 71 federal operatives equipped with authorized search warrants, firearms, and 18 months' worth of compiled investigative materials. The residents rising beyond those gates represented extravagance on a scale
This was not a strike
even
against
for
street
Beverly
dealers
Hills
or border
standards.
couriers. It was a direct attack on the logistics backbone that allowed a cartel to function inside the United States without drawing attention.
Celebrity residence
Federal
features,
officials told
and the
AP
ambitious fantasies of hopeful models who viewed it as the pinnacle achievement in their profession. Vincent Castellano, the property's proprietor, had constructed a commercial empire managing some of the world's most striking faces, propelling professional trajectories that appeared on magazine front pages, runway presentations, and marketing initiatives valued at billions annually. By every metric the modeling world valued, he stood as the most accomplished talent representative the business had ever witnessed. According to evidence accumulated by Special Agent Rebecca Santos and her investigative unit, he was simultaneously the mastermind behind a human trafficking enterprise that had confined 28 young women in concealed rooms beneath his luxurious residence. The investigation originated with a solitary photograph uploaded anonymously to a dark web platform devoted to human commodity exchange. The picture displayed a young woman, blonde, approximately 20 years old, possessing the distinct features and tormented gaze suggesting both attractiveness and anguish, positioned against a backdrop that forensic analysts ultimately traced to a custom wallpaper design manufactured exclusively for one Beverly Hills location. The individual in the photograph had been declared missing from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, 3 years prior, after informing relatives she was journeying to Los Angeles for what she characterized as an extraordinary opportunity with a prominent modeling firm. Emily Hartman was her name, and she had been 20 when she vanished. A small-town young woman with substantial aspirations who had secured local beauty competition victories and captured the interest of talent scouts promising that proper industry connections could launch her to stardom. Those scouts had been personnel of Castellano International, the firm Vincent Castellano established 3 decades earlier and developed into a worldwide powerhouse managing over 300 active models and producing annual income that industry experts calculated exceeded $200 million. Agent Rebecca Santos had been monitoring human trafficking organizations for 12 years when the Emily Hartman photograph reached her workspace, forwarded by an intelligence analyst specializing in dark web marketplace surveillance. Something about the picture had appeared unusual to the analyst compared to typical material circulating in those digital underground channels. The production quality seemed excessively professional, the environment overly refined, the subject's presentation indicating a victim selected for characteristics beyond simple accessibility. Santos had developed confidence in the judgment of analysts who devoted their working hours immersed in humanity's darkest behaviors. Therefore, she pursued the lead, processing the image through facial identification systems, matching the wallpaper design to documented interior decorating, and ultimately linking the photograph to a missing person filing submitted in Iowa 37 months earlier. That connection had revealed a pathway that led, following months of investigation, to one of the fashion world's most distinguished names. As Santos investigated more thoroughly, increasingly troubling patterns materialized. Emily Hartman did not represent an isolated incident. During the preceding 15 years, a minimum of 47 young women had been reported missing following interaction with Castellano International representatives. The actual figure might be considerably higher considering the transient characteristics of the modeling profession and the hesitation of aspiring models to preserve strong connections with relatives who frequently disapproved of their vocational selections. The disappearances encompassed the entire nation. Small Midwestern communities, metropolitan suburban areas, rural localities where scouts would materialize at community gatherings and identify young women possessing the appearance the firm sought. The methodology remained consistent. Initial communication followed by audition or photo session invitations, followed by Los Angeles travel, followed by complete silence. The majority of missing women were ultimately classified as voluntary departures, their files closed by law enforcement departments assuming they had merely elected to sever connections with previous existences and restart anonymously within the entertainment sector's vastness. Several families had demanded deeper examination, retained private investigators, contacted media professionals and advocacy groups, but their attempts had repeatedly encountered barriers seemingly constructed to discourage additional inquiry. The Castellano enterprise demonstrated sophistication, distinguishing it from conventional trafficking networks. Vincent Castellano had invested 3 decades building authentic businesses serving as camouflage for his criminal activities, cultivating relationships with law enforcement officials, political figures, and media personalities who supplied both protection and credible deniability. His firm managed actual models pursuing actual professions, attending actual fashion presentations, appearing in actual marketing campaigns. The women he selected for his private collection originated from a separate pipeline. Aspiring models lacking industry relationships or family support systems that might trigger alarms upon their disappearance. They underwent grooming through processes beginning with apparently legitimate opportunities and progressively isolating them from anyone who might detect their absence. By the moment they comprehended what was transpiring, they were already ensnared in a structure designed to eliminate escape and guarantee compliance. The residence itself constituted the operation's nucleus. Constructed during the 1920s by a silent film producer whose identity had long disappeared from memory, Castellano purchased it in 1998 for an amount generating real estate sector headlines and establishing him as a substantial participant in Beverly Hills social circles. Throughout subsequent years, he invested millions in modifications, transforming the property into a demonstration of affluence and refinement, hosting gatherings attracting entertainment industry elite, and positioning the mansion as an emblem of his accomplishments. What nobody beyond his inner circle understood was that the renovations had incorporated construction of an elaborate underground facility accessible through hidden corridors connecting to the primary structure, engineered to accommodate the women he accumulated and the infrastructure required to sustain their captivity. The facility had been constructed by contractors imported from international locations, laborers speaking minimal English who were returned to their origin countries immediately upon project completion. Their knowledge of what they had created effectively neutralized by geographical distance and linguistic obstacles. It extended beneath the formal landscape surrounding the mansion, a system of soundproofed rooms and passageways capable of holding up to 30 captives in circumstances ranging from austere to opulent depending on their obedience and their worth to Castellano's enterprise. Photography studios existed where the women were compelled to pose for pictures sold on exclusive platforms to purchasers willing to remit substantial sums for access to victims they could never legally acquire. Living accommodations resembling premium hotel quarters existed, designed to preserve the physical presentation of women whose attractiveness constituted their principal commodity. And punishment chambers existed, bare concrete enclosures where those who resisted or attempted escape were confined until their determination was adequately shattered to ensure subsequent compliance. Agent Santos had constructed her case systematically, understanding that any action against a target as influential and connected as Vincent Castellano would encounter intensive examination and demand overwhelming evidence to prevail. She had secured financial documentation displaying payments flowing through shell corporations to individuals connected to dark web marketplaces where trafficking victims were promoted. She had interviewed former Castellano International employees who spoke under immunity guarantees about practices that had concerned them but which they had been too frightened to disclose. She had developed an informant within the mansion personnel, a housekeeper named Maria Elena Gutierrez who had glimpsed sufficient evidence of the underground operation to verify its existence without completely comprehending its magnitude. And she had coordinated with international law enforcement organizations monitoring the consumers of Castellano's products. Affluent men throughout Europe, Asia, and the Middle East who paid premium amounts for access to women whose disappearances had never been adequately investigated. The operation was planned with military operation precision, which in numerous respects it was. Santos had secured participation of FBI tactical squads, local SWAT divisions, and specialists from organizations handling trafficking, organized crime, and victim recovery from captivity. The timing was selected based on intelligence suggesting Castellano would be present at the mansion, minimizing the possibility that he might flee before apprehension. Entry locations were identified, Contingency plans were prepared. Medical professionals were stationed to deliver immediate treatment to victims whose physical and psychological states were unknown. Everything was prepared. Everything except the certainty that the operation would succeed, the awareness that all the preparation imaginable could not eliminate the variables that transformed careful organization into chaotic actuality. The gates opened. The vehicles proceeded. And at 4:31 a.m., federal operatives breached the Castellano Mansion's entrance and commenced the process of dismantling an empire constructed on human suffering. Vincent Castellano was discovered in his third-floor bedroom, awakened by breach sounds and attempting to destroy a laptop containing evidence investigators would subsequently characterize as essential to understanding his operation's complete scope. He was 63 years old, silver-haired and aristocratic, wearing silk nightwear that likely exceeded most Americans' monthly earnings. He did not resist apprehension, did not attempt flight, did not express anything beyond cold disdain for the agents invading his residence. "You're committing a terrible error," he stated as they escorted him away in restraints. "My legal team will have this dismissed before midday." It was the confidence of an individual who had spent decades functioning beyond legal constraints, who believed that his wealth and relationships would shield him from consequences that applied exclusively to lesser individuals. It was also a spectacular misjudgment. The mansion search required over 14 hours and necessitated deployment of specialized teams, including structural engineers, forensic technicians, and K-9 units trained to detect hidden chambers and concealed passages. The underground complex entrance was located behind a wine cellar that itself housed bottles valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars. A false wall that pivoted open when a particular sequence was entered on a keypad disguised as a temperature regulation panel. Beyond the wall lay a staircase descending into darkness, and beyond the staircase lay a horror that would haunt every witness for their remaining existence. The initial chamber they entered was a photography studio equipped with professional illumination, multiple camera configurations, and a collection of costumes and accessories suggesting the variety of scenarios in which the captives had been forced to participate. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, displaying young women in poses ranging from fashion-adjacent to explicitly degrading, their expressions revealing various stages of the psychological destruction that captivity had inflicted. Several photographs were dated, providing a timeline extending back over a decade and suggesting that the operation had been functioning far longer than investigators had initially calculated. Agent Santos photographed everything, documented everything, knowing that each image was simultaneously crime evidence and suffering testimony that would need careful and sensitive handling. Beyond the studio lay the living accommodations, a corridor lined with doors opening onto individual rooms approximately 12 feet by 15 feet. Each room contained a bed, a bathroom, a small television mounted to the wall, and surveillance cameras positioned to eliminate any privacy possibility. Each room also contained a woman, blinking in the harsh tactical flashlight glare, struggling to comprehend armed strangers' presence after months or years of isolation that had conditioned them to expect only their captors. 28 women total, ranging in age from 19 to 34, held for periods ranging from 4 months to 11 years. 28 stories of stolen existences, interrupted aspirations, and suffering that defied straightforward description or comprehension. Emily Hartman was discovered in room 17, alive but barely recognizable as the young woman who had departed Cedar Rapids with fashion magazine cover and runway presentation dreams. 3 years of captivity had aged her in ways transcending mere appearance, had carved lines into her face and shadows into her eyes, speaking of experiences no human being should endure. When Agent Santos identified herself as FBI, told Emily that she was safe, that she was being rescued, that her nightmare was finally concluded, Emily did not respond. She simply stared, her expression vacant, her mind apparently unable to process information contradicting everything she had been conditioned to believe. It would require weeks of therapy and medical treatment before Emily spoke her first words since rescue, and months more before she could articulate what had happened to her in that underground prison. The other victims displayed similar severe trauma symptoms, their rescue responses ranging from catatonic withdrawal to hysterical disbelief to desperate clinging to rescuers they simultaneously feared and needed. Several required immediate hospitalization for medical conditions neglected during their captivity. malnutrition, untreated infections, injuries that had healed improperly without proper care. All required psychological evaluation and support that would continue for years, perhaps lifetimes, as they worked to process experiences that had fundamentally altered their self-understanding and worldview. The medical professionals who treated them described a consistency of symptoms suggesting systematic abuse designed to break resistance while maintaining sufficient physical health to preserve commercial value. A calculus of cruelty that prioritized exploitation over everything else. The investigation following the operation revealed Castellano's operation's complete scope, and it was even more extensive than initial assessments had suggested. The 28 women discovered in the mansion represented only the current inventory. Records recovered from Castellano's computers indicated that at least 73 women had been cycled through the operation over its 16-year history. Some had been sold to overseas purchasers, transported to Middle Eastern and Asian destinations where they had been absorbed into networks that investigators were still working to penetrate. Others had been released after their value diminished, sent away with threats and conditioning ensuring they would never speak about their experiences. A handful had died in captivity, their bodies disposed of in ways the investigation was still working to determine. The scale was staggering. A criminal enterprise that had operated in legitimate business shadows for nearly 2 decades, while generating profits numbering in the tens of millions annually. The complicity question extended far beyond Castellano himself. His operation required infrastructure, photographers, web designers, security personnel, medical staff who kept the captives healthy enough to be commercially viable. It required customers, wealthy individuals who paid for victim access through encrypted platforms promising anonymity and discretion. And it required enablers, industry figures who had heard rumors, noticed irregularities, sensed something was wrong, but chosen not to investigate or report. The arrests following the initial operation numbered 37 over the following 18 months, including a former fashion photographer whose work had appeared in major magazines, a plastic surgeon who had performed procedures on captives without questioning their circumstances, and a technology executive who had built the platform through which Castellano's products were marketed and sold. Each arrest produced new evidence, new names, new connections to an industry that had proven far more corrupt than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Vincent Castellano's trial began 2 years after his arrest in a federal courthouse that had to be fortified against the intense media attention the case had generated. The prosecution presented evidence filling over 40,000 pages of exhibits documenting years of systematic predation through financial records, photographs, intercepted communications, and testimony from survivors who found the courage to face their abuser in open court. The defense, led by an attorney team whose hourly rates exceeded what most Americans earned in a week, attempted to portray Castellano as a successful businessman who had been framed by competitors and pursued by law enforcement agents seeking to build careers on sensational prosecutions. The strategy might have worked in an earlier era, before the public had been educated about human trafficking realities, before survivors had begun to speak out about the structures enabling their exploitation. It failed spectacularly in the courtroom where Vincent Castellano faced judgment for his crimes. The survivor testimony was devastating. One by one, women who had been held in the underground chambers described their experiences. The recruitment, the grooming, the gradual isolation from family and friends, the moment when they realized they were trapped, and the years of exploitation that followed. They spoke of being photographed against their will, of being forced to perform for cameras that broadcast their humiliation to paying customers around the world. They spoke of the punishments inflicted on those who resisted, the psychological manipulation that convinced them no one was searching for them, the despair that had become their constant companion. And they spoke of the moments of hope that had sustained them through the darkness. Glimpses of kindness from fellow captives, dreams of rescue that seemed impossible but refused to die, the determination to survive that had carried them through experiences designed to destroy them. The jurors wept. The gallery wept. Even the judge, a veteran of decades on the bench who had presided over cases involving murder and terrorism, was seen wiping tears from her eyes as the testimony continued. Vincent Castellano was convicted on 189 counts, including human trafficking, kidnapping, forced labor, production and distribution of exploitative material, money laundering, and racketeering. The guilty verdicts took less than 4 hours to reach, a speed reflecting the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the jury's determination to hold him accountable. At sentencing, the judge delivered remarks that would be quoted and studied for years, her words capturing something essential about the crime's nature and the inadequacy of any punishment the law could impose. The defendant did not merely exploit his victims, she said. He erased them. He took young women full of hope and dreams and promise, and he reduced them to products to be photographed and sold. He stole not just their freedom but their very identities, their sense of themselves as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. No sentence can restore what he took. No punishment can balance the scales of justice. The court can only ensure that he will never again have the opportunity to harm another person and pray that those he has harmed will find healing that he does not deserve to witness. The sentence was 12 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, the maximum allowed under federal sentencing guidelines. Castellano received it without visible emotion, his face maintaining the same mask of contempt he had worn throughout the proceedings. He was transferred immediately to a maximum security federal penitentiary, where he would spend his remaining years in conditions that, while Spartan by his former lifestyle standards, were far more humane than those he had imposed on his victims. The disparity troubled many who followed the case, who wondered whether true justice was even possible for crimes of such magnitude, who questioned whether any prison cell could adequately address the suffering that had been inflicted in the chambers beneath the Beverly Hills mansion. The Castellano case triggered a reckoning in the modeling industry that extended far beyond the immediate circle of those involved in his operation. Fashion magazines that had featured images produced by photographers connected to the network faced boycotts and subscription cancellations. Modeling agencies across the country scrambled to implement oversight mechanisms that might detect similar operations before they could take root. Advocacy organizations that had long warned about young models' vulnerability to exploitation saw their warnings finally taken seriously, their recommendations for reform adopted by an industry that could no longer pretend ignorance. It was not enough. No reform could ever fully protect against predators determined to exploit systemic vulnerabilities. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that the structures enabling Castellano's crimes required fundamental change. The Beverly Hills mansion was seized by the federal government as proceeds of criminal enterprise, its contents auctioned to raise funds for victim services, and its structure eventually demolished after investigators determined that no legitimate use could purify a space so thoroughly contaminated by suffering. The underground complex was filled with concrete. The gardens above it cleared and replaced with a memorial park that bore the names of the 28 women rescued from captivity, along with plaques commemorating those whose fate remained unknown. A sculpture at the center of the park depicted a woman breaking chains, her posture simultaneously vulnerable and triumphant, her face lifted toward a sky she had long been denied. The sculptor, herself a survivor of trafficking though not from Castellano's operation, described the work as a representation of resilience rather than victimhood, a reminder that human beings could survive experiences designed to destroy them and emerge capable of creating beauty from the memory of horror. Emily Hartman returned to Cedar Rapids after 2 years of intensive therapy and medical treatment, uncertain of what she would find in a community that had largely moved on during her absence. Her parents, who had never stopped believing she was alive despite the official closure of her missing person case, welcomed her with a love that helped begin the long process of rebuilding what had been destroyed. She did not return to modeling, could not imagine returning to an industry that had been weaponized against her, but found unexpected purpose in advocacy work, speaking at schools and community organizations about the signs of trafficking and the importance of questioning opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Her testimony before Congress contributed to the passage of legislation strengthening protections for models and other workers in industries with high trafficking risk, a legacy that would outlast the trauma that had nearly consumed her. Agent Rebecca Santos continued her work with the FBI's trafficking task force, but the Castellano case had marked her in ways she struggled to articulate. She had seen the worst of human nature exposed in those underground chambers, had looked into the eyes of women whose hope had been methodically destroyed over years of captivity, had confronted the reality that such evil could flourish in the midst of luxury and privilege that most people associated with success and achievement. She became more aggressive in pursuing similar cases, more willing to challenge assumptions about who could be a trafficker and who could be a victim, more convinced that the surfaces of American life concealed depths of exploitation that required constant vigilance to address. She was promoted twice in the years following the case, eventually leading a division dedicated specifically to trafficking in the entertainment and hospitality industries. Her work contributed to dozens of additional prosecutions and hundreds of rescues, a record of accomplishment that colleagues described as unparalleled in the Bureau's history. The international dimension of Castellano's network proved particularly difficult to address. Women who had been sold overseas remained largely beyond the reach of American law enforcement, trapped in countries where corruption and complicity shielded their captors from accountability. Interpol coordinated efforts to track these victims and their buyers, working with national agencies that often lacked resources or political will to prioritize trafficking cases. Some successes emerged over the following years. A businessman in Dubai arrested, a trafficking network in Southeast Asia dismantled, a handful of survivors located and offered assistance in returning to their home countries. But many more remained unaccounted for, their fates unknown, their suffering continuing while the machinery of international justice ground slowly toward outcomes that might never arrive. Maria Elena Gutierrez, the housekeeper whose information had been crucial in confirming the underground complex's existence, was relocated with her family to a different state under a new identity. She had risked everything to provide intelligence that she feared might result in her own arrest as an accessory, and Agent Santos had ensured that her cooperation was rewarded with protection and a fresh start rather than prosecution. Maria Elena never spoke publicly about her role in the case, preferring anonymity to the attention that would have followed disclosure. But she kept a photograph of Emily Hartman in her wallet, a reminder of why she had chosen to act when silence would have been safer, a testament to the difference that ordinary courage could make in a world that often seemed designed to reward complicity. The survivors of the Castellano operation scattered across the country following their recovery, each pursuing paths determined by circumstances and choices that reflected the diversity of their experiences and backgrounds. Some returned to families who had never stopped searching for them, rebuilding relationships that captivity had interrupted. Others sought anonymity in new cities where no one knew their stories, constructing identities that allowed them to move through the world without constantly confronting what had been done to them. A few pursued advocacy work, using their experiences to educate others and push for reforms that might prevent similar suffering. And a handful, remarkably, returned to modeling, not for the agencies that had enabled their exploitation, but for organizations specifically created to provide opportunities for trafficking survivors, platforms that prioritized empowerment over exploitation and treated models as human beings rather than commodities. The fashion industry's response to the Castellano revelations evolved over the years following the trial, moving through phases of shock, denial, defensive reform, and eventually something approaching genuine reckoning. Major fashion houses implemented due diligence requirements for the agencies they worked with, conducting background checks and demanding transparency about recruitment and employment practices. Industry associations established certification programs for agencies meeting ethical standards, providing consumers and clients with tools to distinguish responsible operators from potential predators. Journalists who had previously celebrated Castellano as an industry titan now devoted columns and features to investigating similar patterns elsewhere, bringing to light abuses that might have remained hidden without the attention generated by the case. The changes were imperfect, incomplete, susceptible to the same pressures that had enabled Castellano's operation to flourish for so long. But they represented progress, an acknowledgement that business as usual was no longer acceptable in an industry that had been forced to confront the worst consequences of its indifference. The final count of Castellano's victims was never definitively established. The 28 women rescued from the mansion and the additional names documented in his records represented only those whose existence had been captured in evidence that survived destruction and concealment. Investigators believed that the actual number was significantly higher, encompassing victims from the early years of the operation whose records had been destroyed and women whose disappearances had never been connected to Castellano's network. They remained anonymous, these unknown victims, their stories untold, their suffering unacknowledged except in the aggregate statistics that tried to capture the scope of human trafficking in America. Each year, thousands of people disappeared under circumstances suggesting exploitation rather than voluntary departure. Most were never found. Most were never properly investigated. The Castellano case had illuminated one corner of a shadow that covered the entire country, but the shadow itself remained vast and dark and filled with stories that might never be brought to light. Vincent Castellano died in federal prison 9 years after his conviction of complications related to a stroke that had left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak for the final 18 months of his life. He never expressed remorse for his crimes, never cooperated with ongoing investigations that might have provided closure to families still searching for loved ones, never acknowledged the humanity of the women he had exploited and sold. His death was reported briefly in industry publications and true crime websites, noted by survivors who felt neither satisfaction nor relief at the news, and then forgotten by a world that had moved on to newer scandals and fresher outrages. The memorial park that occupied the site of his former mansion remained, its plaques weathering with time but still legible, its central sculpture still reaching toward a sky that represented freedom from chains that had bound so many for so long. Agent Santos visited the memorial on the 10th anniversary of the raid, standing alone in the early morning light before the other visitors arrived. She thought about Emily Hartman and the 27 other women rescued from the underground chambers, about their struggles and their resilience, and the lives they had built from the wreckage of their stolen years. She thought about the victims who remained overseas, still trapped in networks that the Castellano case had exposed but not destroyed. She thought about the women whose names she would never know, whose disappearances had never been investigated, whose suffering had never been documented. And she thought about the work that remained. The cases still open, the survivors still seeking justice, the predators still operating in shadows that grew longer every time attention shifted to something else. The park was beautiful in the morning light, the flowers blooming in beds that had been planted where rooms of horror once stood, the sculpture casting a shadow that moved across the grass as the sun rose higher. It was a place of healing now, a place where survivors could come to remember and reflect and find community with others who understood what they had experienced. School groups visited regularly, learning about trafficking and exploitation, absorbing lessons that might help them recognize danger and protect themselves or others. The transformation from House of Horrors to Place of Hope was incomplete. Such transformations always were, but it was real, a testament to the possibility of creating meaning from meaningless suffering. Santos left the park as other visitors began to arrive, returning to the office where new cases awaited her attention. There was always more work. There would always be more work. The forces that created trafficking victims were embedded in the structures of society, in the inequalities and vulnerabilities that predators learned to exploit, in the indifference that allowed exploitation to flourish undetected. But every case mattered. Every victim rescued was a life restored. Every conviction was a message that exploitation would not be tolerated, that consequences existed for those who treated human beings as commodities. The work continued as it always had, as it always would, one case at a time, one victim at a time, one small victory against an enemy that could never be completely defeated but must never be allowed to triumph unopposed. The story of the Castellano mansion and the 28 women found beneath it would eventually fade from public consciousness, replaced by newer scandals and newer heroes, absorbed into the endless churn of news and entertainment that characterized modern life. But for those who had lived it, the survivors, the investigators, the families who had waited and wondered and finally received answers, it would never be just a story. It would be the defining experience of their lives, the lens through which they understood the world and their place in it. It would be Emily Hartman's courage in testifying against her abuser, and Agent Santos's determination to pursue justice regardless of how powerful the target. It would be the memorial park that bloomed each spring on ground that had once held such darkness, and the survivors who returned each year to remember those who had not made it out. It would be the knowledge, hard-won and precious, that even the most sophisticated evil could be exposed when someone refused to look away, that even the deepest suffering could give way to healing when support was offered without condition, that even the most broken lives could be rebuilt when the opportunity for rebuilding was provided. The fashion industry continued to evolve, shaped by scandals and reforms and technological changes that altered how models were discovered, represented, and compensated. The safeguards implemented after the Castellano case became standard practice, embedded in contracts and certification requirements and the due diligence processes that responsible operators followed. Whether they would prove sufficient to prevent similar operations from emerging remained an open question, one that would be answered only over time as predators tested new methods and society adapted or failed to adapt in response. But the awareness that the case had created endured, a collective understanding that the glamour of fashion concealed dangers that could destroy lives if left unaddressed. It was not enough. Awareness was never enough by itself, but it was necessary, a foundation on which more substantive protections could be built. The last survivor of the Castellano operation to pass away did so in 2069 at the age of 71 in hospice care, surrounded by family members who had helped her rebuild a life that exploitation had nearly destroyed. Her name was Jessica Thornton, and she had been held in the underground chambers for 7 years before the raids set her free. She had spent her post-rescue decades as a painter, creating works that processed trauma through color and form, that transformed suffering into beauty, that demonstrated the capacity of the human spirit to create meaning from experiences designed to destroy meaning. Her final paintings, completed in the months before her death, depicted the memorial park at various times of day and in various seasons, the sculpture at its center serving as a constant while the light and atmosphere changed around it. They were beautiful and haunting, these paintings, and they were eventually donated to a museum that specialized in art created by trafficking survivors, where they would speak to future generations about resilience and survival and the possibility of transcendence. The memorial park remained, tended by an endowment that ensured its perpetual maintenance, visited by thousands each year who came to pay respects and learn about what had happened there. The names on the plaques remained legible, preserved through periodic restoration, each name a reminder that behind the statistics and the legal proceedings and the policy reforms were individual human beings whose lives had been stolen and whose suffering deserved to be remembered. The sculpture at the center continued to reach toward the sky, its gesture of liberation unchanged since the day it was installed, a permanent symbol of what was possible when chains were broken and hope was restored. The ripple effects of the Castellano case extended into corners of the fashion industry that had never before faced scrutiny. Modeling schools that had served as recruiting grounds for legitimate agencies and occasionally for operations far more sinister implemented new oversight protocols and background check requirements. Photography studios that had once operated with minimal accountability now faced licensing requirements and periodic inspections. Even social media platforms, which had become increasingly important for discovering and promoting new talent, developed algorithms designed to flag suspicious recruitment patterns and protect vulnerable young people from predatory outreach. The reforms were imperfect, as all reforms were, subject to the same pressures and circumventions that had allowed Castellano to operate for so long. But they represented a shift in awareness, an acknowledgement that the industry's historical indifference to exploitation could no longer be sustained. The families of victims who had never been found continued their searches long after the Castellano trial concluded, hoping that the publicity generated by the case might produce leads that had never emerged before. Some received answers, calls from law enforcement agencies who had connected old missing person reports to evidence recovered from Castellano's records, visits from investigators who could finally provide closure even when the news was devastating. Others waited in vain, their loved ones among the unknown number who had passed through operations like Castellano's without leaving traces that could be followed. For these families, the Castellano case was both vindication and torment. Proof that their suspicions had been justified, that their refusal to accept official explanations had been correct, but also a reminder that justice arrived too late for those who had been lost and would never be recovered. The psychological research that emerged from the Castellano case contributed to a growing understanding of trafficking trauma and its long-term effects on survivors. Mental health professionals who treated the 28 women published studies documenting patterns of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and dissociation that provided valuable guidance for clinicians encountering similar cases. They described the particular challenges of treating victims who had been exploited for their physical appearance, whose sense of self had been systematically attacked through objectification and degradation designed to maximize commercial value while destroying personal identity. The research influenced therapeutic protocols worldwide, helping clinicians understand that trafficking survivors required specialized approaches that addressed the unique nature of their trauma rather than generic treatments designed for other forms of abuse. One survivor who had earned a doctorate in clinical psychology after her rescue became a leading researcher in the field, dedicating her career to developing interventions specifically designed for trafficking victims. Her work emphasized the importance of restoring agency and identity to people who had been systematically stripped of both, of helping survivors reclaim their bodies and their stories from those who had stolen them. Castellano thought he was destroying us, she said in a lecture that was viewed millions of times online. He reduced us to images, to products, to objects for consumption. But we were always more than that. We are always more than that. And the work of recovery is the work of remembering who we were before they tried to erase us and discovering who we can become after. The technology platforms that had facilitated Castellano's operation faced their own reckoning in the years following the trial. The encrypted networks through which he had marketed his victims were targeted by law enforcement agencies and cybersecurity researchers who worked to identify and shut down similar operations. New legislation required platforms to implement more robust monitoring for trafficking-related content, with significant penalties for those that failed to act on evidence of exploitation. The debate over privacy versus safety that had long characterized discussions of Internet regulation took on new urgency as the Castellano case illustrated the real-world consequences of platforms that prioritized anonymity over accountability. The balance was never perfectly struck. It could not be, given the legitimate privacy interests that competed with the need to detect and prevent trafficking. But the case ensured that the discussion continued, that complacency was harder to sustain, that the costs of inaction were impossible to ignore. The modeling industry's international dimension proved particularly challenging to reform. Fashion was a global business, with models recruited in one country, represented by agencies in another, and photographed in locations scattered across the world. The fragmentation created opportunities for exploitation that national regulations could not fully address, as predators learned to operate across jurisdictions and exploit gaps in international coordination. Interpol and other international agencies worked to develop frameworks for sharing information and coordinating investigations, but progress was slow, hampered by competing priorities and the fundamental difficulty of achieving consensus among nations with different legal systems and different levels of commitment to addressing trafficking. The Castellano case had exposed the problem. Solving it would require decades of sustained effort and political will that remained uncertain. The sun set over the park on a Thursday evening in late summer, casting long shadows across the grounds where horror had once dwelt and healing now resided. Somewhere in the city beyond, young women with dreams of modeling careers were making decisions about opportunities that might lead to stardom or might lead to exploitation. The work of protecting them continued, imperfect and incomplete, but vital nonetheless. The legacy of the 28 women found in the Castellano mansion lived on in the precautions that might save others from similar fates, in the awareness that had been raised, in the reforms that had been implemented, in the determination of those who refused to accept that trafficking was an inevitable feature of an industry built on beauty and desire. The story was not over. The story would never be over. But this chapter had ended, and in its ending, something that resembled hope had emerged.